Over 12 million people watched in shock as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett went head-to-head with Senator Josh Hawley, accused of manipulating media pressure during the 2020 election and secretly pocketing a $250,000 foreign-linked donation. In a relentless takedown, Crockett unleashed a wave of undeniable evidence that left Hawley visibly shaken and, after 12 untouchable years, bowing his head in public disgrace. His defense crumbled, his team panicked, and America held its breath. What did Jasmine say that brought a powerful senator to his knees and left the nation speechless? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the low glow of a Capitol Hill office light, something dangerous came to life. A staffer hit play on a hidden audio file. What followed wasn't a conversation, it was an order. Senator Josh Hawley's voice, calm and commanding, cut through the silence. Push Georgia, push Arizona. If the media turns, they will fold. No emotion, no hesitation, just cold, calculated strategy. The file had been leaked anonymously just hours before, buried in a folder marked Shielded Comms 2020. It wasn't alone. Alongside it were 17 internal emails filled with phrases like suppress oversight and keep it off the record. This wasn't political spin. This was a blueprint to pressure the 2020 election process and avoid being caught. By morning, panic spread quietly across Capitol Hill. Reporters scrambled. Security teams flagged the leak as credible and active. The chair of the House Oversight Committee took one look at the dossier and didn't blink. She called an emergency session. Every member of the committee agreed this could not wait. It was explosive. If real, it meant a sitting U.S. senator had manipulated public trust from behind closed doors and left fingerprints. And then came the final decision. Who would lead the questioning? Who could face down a senator like Hawley and not flinch? The answer was clear. Jasmine Crockett, a former civil rights attorney. Sharp, relentless, and impossible to intimidate. As the committee prepared, someone placed the thick file in front of her. The chair leaned in and said, "You're the one. No one else is smart enough or brave enough to do this." Jasmine stared at the cover of the file. Then she picked up her pen and quietly said, "Let's begin." And so, with the nation watching and the weight of the evidence tightening like a noose, the Capitol doors opened and the battle began, not with bullets, but with silence, stares, and sworn oaths. The hearing chamber felt less like a courtroom and more like a stage awaiting its final act. Murmurs died instantly as Senator Josh Hawley entered through the west doors, flanked by 2 attorneys and a press aide clutching papers he would never get to use. Hawley's gait was unhurried, almost theatrical. He straightened his cuffs, adjusted the small U.S. flag pin on his lapel, and smirked as if the moment was beneath him. Reporters leaned forward, waiting for a sign of regret. Instead, he offered a line soaked in arrogance. "I haven't done anything wrong. They're just scared of me." Camera flashes exploded. He didn't blink. He took his seat as if it were a throne, not a witness chair. The panel sat stone-faced. This wasn't a campaign rally. This was Judgment Day. Moments later, another door opened. No entourage, no whispers. Jasmine Crockett walked in alone. No makeup team, no handlers. Just a jet black suit, flat shoes, and a sealed metal briefcase hugged tightly in her left hand. She didn't wave. She didn't look around. She walked straight toward the hearing table with the quiet fury of someone who came for one reason only, the truth. Her eyes locked on Hawley like a laser beam that didn't need volume to threaten. When the clerk asked him to raise his right hand and swear to tell the truth, Hawley's smile twitched. But Jasmine spoke first. Calm, controlled, deadly. "Choose your words carefully, Senator, because I brought the facts, and the facts don't flinch." For the first time, the room went quiet enough to hear the hum of the lights. The game had changed. The hunter had arrived. But Crockett hadn't come to match Hawley's theatrics. She came to dismantle them, piece by piece, starting with the image that had burned into America's memory, like a scar that wouldn't heal. She rose from her chair with the deliberate calm of someone who didn't need to raise her voice to raise the stakes. The moment she clicked the remote, all side conversations died. Lights dimmed slightly, not by accident, but by design. Behind her, a large government-issued monitor lit up. No music, no narration, just cold, silent video footage. On the screen, Senator Josh Hawley outside the Capitol on January 6, 2021. A black coat, a clenched fist, his face composed, almost pleased. The crowd roared back at him like he was a general giving a command. Crockett let the silence stretch just enough to make it uncomfortable. Then she spoke, each word cutting clean. "Senator Hawley, this was you at 1:14 p.m. outside the East Gate. You raised your fist in what your office later called a gesture of solidarity. Solidarity with whom?" The question floated for only a second before Hawley leaned forward. His voice dipped in condescension. "I was encouraging peaceful protest. That's protected speech." His delivery was smooth, like he'd said it 100 times. But it was too smooth, too clean. And Jasmine Crockett was not here for rehearsed lines. Without a word, she pressed the remote again. The screen changed. What followed wasn't theory, it was evidence. Grainy surveillance footage pulled from a nearby private building's rooftop camera. The Capitol wasn't in the center of the frame, but the crowd was. More importantly, the crowd's reaction. A man in a camo jacket turned abruptly toward his group, pointed to the Capitol, and shouted, "He gave the signal! It's now!" Then came movement, urgent, focused. Crates that looked like toolboxes were opened. Zip ties, gloves, gas masks. The coordination wasn't chaotic. It was timed, as if they'd been waiting for something, or someone. Crockett stood still, letting the image speak for itself. Then slowly she turned back to the senator. Her voice dropped, but her clarity sharpened like a scalpel. "You didn't just wave, Senator," she said coldly. "You triggered a breach." A ripple ran through the room. Members of the committee shifted in their seats. Hawley blinked twice but said nothing. Crockett turned to the chair and then addressed the full panel, her voice unwavering. "We teach children that symbols have meaning. Are we to believe a sitting senator doesn't know that better than anyone?" There was no outburst, no applause, just an eerie silence. A silence full of recognition, the kind that falls over a room when something dark has just been named aloud. The raised fist, once a campaign poster image, now stood framed by context, shredded, stripped of deniability, and laid bare for what it was. Jasmine hadn't just replayed a video. She had turned a gesture into an indictment, and the courtroom was no longer in doubt of who had thrown the first match into the fire. But Crockett wasn't finished, not even close. Exposing the signal was only the first crack. What came next would split the room wide open. She moved with a precision that felt almost too calm for what she was about to unleash. No grand gestures, no raised voice, just quiet confidence, like a surgeon preparing the final incision. She placed both palms on the edge of the desk and leaned slightly forward, her eyes locked on Senator Hawley, who now sat with his arms crossed but his expression notably less smug. Then, without breaking eye contact, she reached for the black metal briefcase that had been beside her since the start of the hearing. Until now, it had sat untouched, almost forgotten. But everyone in the room had noticed it. It was too deliberate not to matter. With a slow, calculated motion, Crockett popped the latches. The soft, metallic click echoed like a trigger in a silent room. She pulled out a manila folder, clean, flat, unmarked. She held it for a second, then opened it and removed a single sheet. There was no seal, no dramatic heading, just plain white paper and black ink. But the content made it burn hotter than any classified file. Crockett stepped away from the desk and walked slowly to the center of the floor, holding the page like a teacher presenting a test result that couldn't be argued. She began calmly but firmly, her voice carrying a weight that no microphone could enhance. This was sent at 2:43 a.m. on the morning of January 6th from the address hawley.office.missouri@protonmail.com. Gasps were already escaping lips, but she didn't stop. The subject line was blank. The message read, and I quote, "Push hard. Arizona and Georgia won't hold if the press applies pressure." She let the words hang, not rush through them, not shout them, just say them, clear and clean, like truth should be. The room didn't move. Members of the committee stared at her, blinking slowly as the weight of those sentences pressed down like a storm front. Some leaned in, Others stiffened, but no one looked away. She glanced at Hawley. He didn't speak. His eyes narrowed, but his mouth stayed shut. His lawyer leaned in, ready to whisper, but Crockett stepped in before he could. Not a statement of fact, not a reflection of public sentiment, a directive, a pressure strategy. Then came the next hit, colder, sharper, irrefutable. Sent from an encrypted email, registered under a fake name, but verified through server metadata to originate from your campaign headquarters. The silence was now deafening. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. You could hear someone in the gallery shift in their seat. Even the stenographer looked up for a brief second, her fingers hovering above the keys. One committee member slowly uncapped their pen, then set it down again, as if unsure whether to take notes or just process what had just detonated in front of them. Crockett took 2 calm steps back to her seat, set the document gently on the desk like it was something alive, and then spoke again. This time not to the room, but directly to the man across from her. "Would you like to explain, Senator?" The question wasn't rhetorical. It was an opening, but not the kind you wanted. It was a cliff edge, and all Hawley had to do was step forward. But he didn't. He looked at the document, then at the table. His jaw tightened. That was all. No rebuttal, no defense. Just quiet calculation in his eyes, flickering behind panic he couldn't quite mask. Crockett didn't wait for an answer. She pivoted her body slightly toward the panel, her tone steady, controlled, but now laced with something colder. Disgust. This wasn't policy. This was manipulation. And it wasn't anonymous. "It has your fingerprints, Senator." Her delivery wasn't dramatic. It was exact. And because of that, it hit harder. She wasn't performing. She was prosecuting. And she didn't need to shout, because the truth had already done that for her. What she faced wasn't just a senator. It was a symbol of something more dangerous. Unchecked power, hidden behind patriotic slogans and encrypted accounts. She didn't look for applause. She didn't need it, because the moment was already hers. Josh Hawley, for the first time in the hearing, looked like a man aware of gravity, and Jasmine Crockett had just pulled the floor out from under his feet. But the room hadn't truly gasped, hadn't truly buckled, until she called her next witness, a name missing from every guest list, a man whose very appearance rewrote the rules of the hearing. The door to the witness chamber opened slowly, as if even the hinges hesitated to let the past walk back in. A man stepped forward, tall, angular, his face drawn not with fear, but fatigue, the kind that settles into the bones of someone who has kept a secret too long. He walked with deliberate, almost reluctant steps, flanked closely by 2 U.S. Marshals. The sharp lighting above caught the edges of his gray blazer and cast shadows under his eyes. Whispers rose and then fell like a wave breaking against silence as the realization spread through the room. Reuben Castle, former Deputy Communications Director for Josh Hawley's 2018 campaign. His name had been forgotten by most, but not by the ones who understood how campaigns were really run. For years, he had vanished from the public record, rumored to have left politics altogether. Now he reemerged not as a player, but as a witness under federal protection. And when Jasmine Crockett motioned toward the clerk, there was no need for introductions. Everyone understood the gravity of what was about to happen. She stood still, giving Reuben space to breathe, to choose his words without rush. Then, in a voice that neither trembled nor boomed, she prompted, "State your name and your role under oath." He did so with measured calm, his right hand raised, his eyes never leaving the center of the room. Then, without flourish or embellishment, he delivered the truth like a blade sliding between old armor. "We deliberately used encrypted email to avoid Missouri's Sunshine Law. The order came directly from Senator Hawley." There was no explosion, no cries or protests, just a long, unsettling silence. It was the kind of silence that felt earned, heavy, like everyone in the room had just heard something they weren't prepared to hear out loud, even if they'd suspected it for years. Reuben didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The sentence stood on its own, as stark and unmovable as a courtroom verdict. Crockett gave a single nod, acknowledging the weight of it without theatrics. Then she raised a small flash drive from her binder, silver unmarked, and handed it to the technician. Her words were quiet, controlled, and razor-sharp. Play the file. The audio began with a low click, followed by a few seconds of ambient noise, a chair shifting, maybe a cough in the background. And then came the voice. Familiar, calm, Josh Hawley. They're not fast enough to catch it. As long as it doesn't make the press, we're good. There was something chilling in how casual it was. No urgency, no fear. Just a man speaking with the confidence of someone who believed the system was too slow to matter. The tone wasn't desperate, it was smug, calculated, certain. The words fell into the chamber like slow drops of oil on water, spreading wide, sticking to every surface. The effect was immediate. One member of the oversight committee leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands clasped but trembling. Another shifted in their seat and whispered something inaudible to an aide. Journalists looked up from their notepads. The room was suddenly colder, the kind of cold that has nothing to do with air conditioning. Even the ceiling lights seemed dimmer under the weight of what had just been said. The weight of Hawley's voice echoing through the chamber still lingered like smoke. But silence for a man like him was more dangerous than scandal, and he refused to sit in it. He exploded upward from his chair as though the very act of remaining seated would condemn him. The suddenness of his movement startled even his own staffers behind him, who instinctively pulled back. Both hands slammed onto the oak table with a force that reverberated across the microphone feed, causing a faint pop that startled the room into stillness. He leaned forward, jaw locked, voice pitched louder than protocol allowed. Not out of authority, but out of something far more fragile. Urgency. I have never said that phrase in any context like what was implied, he shouted, eyes darting to the press pool and then to the committee members, as if looking for anyone who might still believe him. His tone was sharp, but the rhythm was off. His words spilled too fast, too jagged, like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. That recording could be edited, distorted, completely out of context, he barked again, the edge in his voice not persuasive, but panicked. Then came the pivot, the classic tactic, attack the messenger. That so-called witness was terminated for cause. He's a disgruntled staffer with a grudge and no credibility. The phrase hung in the air, but it didn't land the way he'd hoped. Instead of undercutting the accusation, it only drew attention to how personal this had become. He gestured angrily toward the USB drive still sitting beneath the monitors like a lit fuse. And this? This is not admissible under any federal standard. It's hearsay, weaponized hearsay. The phrase rang louder than intended, not because of what it meant, but because of how loudly he needed to say it. A flicker of something, fear maybe, passed across his face, too quick to be labeled, but too honest to ignore. For a man trained in sound bites, that crack in his voice was the first thing he couldn't control. Before his unraveling could fully spiral, the chair of the committee calmly raised her hand. Not high, not dramatic, just enough. Her voice was firm, unshaken, and laced with authority drawn from years of watching men like Hawley think rage equals righteousness. Senator Hawley, this is a formal hearing. Your objections are noted, and you will have time for full rebuttal in writing. But if you continue to interrupt, I will ask the sergeant-at-arms to intervene. There was no venom in her voice, only discipline. The reminder was clinical. He wasn't above the process. And in this room, decorum would not bend to bluster. The impact was immediate. Hawley inhaled sharply, his shoulders rising with the effort to contain what had clearly almost burst. He dropped back into his chair with a tension that couldn't be hidden. His suit, once immaculate, now looked too tight around the collar. His hands, clenched just moments ago, were now flat on the table, motionless. But the damage was done. Around the room, members scribbled faster. Aides whispered behind clipboards. Journalists tapped out headlines. The sense that had been building for the past hour, fragile but rising, suddenly solidified. Josh Hawley was no longer in control. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett remained exactly as she had been, seated, composed, still. Her fingers rested lightly against one another on the table. She didn't speak. She didn't gloat. She didn't even shift in her chair. Her silence wasn't passive. It was tactical. A silence that said, "You panicked." I didn't have to move. Her gaze, steady and unreadable, made clear what her lips never had to. That was only the beginning. I haven't even turned the page yet. But just as the dust from Hawley's outburst began to settle, Jasmine Crockett moved again, this time with the slow certainty of someone about to drop a truth so heavy the room might not recover. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gesture for effect. She simply reached into a slim, zippered compartment at the base of her briefcase and pulled out what looked, at first, entirely ordinary, a single, time-worn envelope. It was yellowed at the edges, the paper brittle, folding lines creased deep like scars. The kind of document that had been touched too many times, yet never spoken of aloud. No government stamp, no lawyer's watermark, just handwriting, shaky and deliberate, in dark blue ink. Crockett turned it gently, holding it with both hands as if it were fragile, not just in paper, but in consequence. Then she spoke, quietly, but with the tone of someone who knew the weight of what she carried. This letter was written by Irene Lathrop, a lifelong administrative coordinator for the Missouri Republican Caucus. She passed away last fall from terminal cancer. The room stilled again. Crockett let the moment breathe. She wanted this read. She wrote it knowing she wouldn't live to testify. A single page, handwritten. Crockett held it up so the cameras could catch it. Then she began to read, her voice steady, crisp, each word carefully pronounced. Josh asked me to use my personal address, not the office one, said it was cleaner. He gave me a name, American Shield for Liberty, and a number, 250,000. I transferred it just like he told me. I didn't ask questions then. I should have. That money came from a passee tied to international contributors. I found that out later. I regret it every day. The last line hit like a whisper in a hurricane. Tell the truth. I won't be here to defend it. Crockett paused, letting the final sentence land. The silence that followed was not the silence of confusion, but of clarity, of consequence. A wave of unease spread across the chamber. Some looked down, others just stared at the letter like it had teeth. It didn't need shouting. It didn't need charts or exhibits or a damning headline. It was a confession written in dying ink. The kind of evidence that lives beyond politics, beyond denial. The kind that speaks louder because it comes from someone with nothing left to gain and everything to clear. And then came the twist. Crockett looked up, met the eyes of the committee chair, then turned the letter over for the cameras. Pinned to the back of the page was a photocopy of a wire transfer form. The recipient account name had been redacted, but the sender was clear: American Shield for Liberty. A known nonprofit flagged by multiple watchdog groups for alleged laundering of political contributions through a series of shell organizations linked to Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Crockett didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The name itself triggered recognition in the room. Journalists began typing at once. Several staffers exchanged glances. The moment had shifted again, from implication to evidence, from speculation to documented, paper trail reality. Hawley remained motionless, but his silence was no longer controlled. It was calculated, a cold, frozen attempt to suppress the panic that had now reached his collar. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscles at his temple pulsed. He didn't deny it. He couldn't. Not yet. Not without knowing what else she had. Crockett stepped back from the microphone, her tone even quieter now, but somehow more cutting. This was never about one email, or one video, or one voice recording. This is a pattern of evasion, of manipulation, of men who believe accountability is optional as long as they speak confidently enough. But the truth doesn't need to shout. She placed the letter gently back into its sleeve and tapped it twice with her fingertip. This woman, with nothing left but the truth, gave more to justice than half the people who walk these halls. The room didn't clap. No one moved, because applause would have cheapened what had just happened. It wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning, delivered not with fury, but with precision. In a single page, Crockett had turned morality into testimony, and testimony into undeniable proof. No theatrics, just facts, uncomfortably real and now fully public. From the far end of the dais, a voice whispered, "She brought the damn letter." Another murmured, "That's the nail." And everyone watching, whether in the room or across the country, knew exactly what that meant. Jasmine Crockett hadn't raised her voice, but she had just buried a defense 6 years in the making. But just as the final document burned its way into public memory and Crockett's words still echoed in the dome above them, the senator's team made a desperate move, not to defend his innocence, but to silence the broadcast. The tension in the room hadn't yet broken when the sound of a chair scraping sharply against marble sliced through the atmosphere like a blade. All eyes turned as Hawley's lead attorney stood abruptly, his expression tight with urgency, his grip on a legal folder so forceful the papers inside had begun to bend. He didn't approach the microphone with confidence. He lunged toward it with the tone of a man who knew the tide had turned against him and was trying to stop a flood with a single sheet of paper. "Madam Chair," he began, trying to steady his voice, though it carried the unmistakable edge of panic. "We submit a formal emergency request to immediately halt the live stream of these proceedings due to the sensitive and potentially defamatory nature of the materials being disclosed." Gasps didn't erupt. They froze. They stuck in throats and widened eyes. For a moment, time fractured. The gallery stilled, journalists stopped mid-typing, and across the top row, a house production technician paused with trembling fingers over the control board, waiting for orders that might never come. The attorney continued, pushing forward like a man sprinting through fog. "We are concerned that continued broadcasting may irreparably damage not only Senator Hawley's reputation, but the integrity of this institution." The word integrity rang hollow in the room now filled with evidence, testimony, and a letter written by a dying staffer. He didn't mention the truth. He didn't mention the public's right to know. He spoke of reputation, damage control, image. The chair of the committee did not react at first. She didn't flinch. She didn't shuffle papers or consult advisors. She simply allowed the silence to stretch long enough for the full weight of the moment to settle. Her eyes moved across the room slowly, over the faces of staffers, over the committee members, over the press, until they landed squarely on the attorney, still gripping his motion like a last defense. Then she leaned slightly forward, hands folded atop the table, and delivered her response with the calm power of someone who had seen fear wear every face imaginable. "If someone in this room is shaking, it is not because we're being unfair. It's because the truth is finally reaching them." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The words themselves struck like a gavel. And then, without theatrics, she added the line that would become the headline, the quote that would echo through news cycles in hearings to come. "And the American people have a right to witness the moment accountability walks in the front door." Across the room, the technician's hand hovered over the pause button for 1 second longer, then lowered it completely. The feed continued. The red recording light blinked on. The hearing remained live, no applause, no cheers, but the air shifted again, this time decisively. The attempted shutdown, the blatant move to pull the curtain down over a public reckoning, had not only failed, it had drawn more attention to what they were trying to hide. Viewership online spiked within seconds. Social media lit up with hashtags, commentary, disbelief. People weren't just watching a hearing anymore. They were watching someone try to run from it in real time and fail. Josh Hawley sat motionless, his hands locked together on the table, his expression unreadable. But his silence said everything. He hadn't spoken, hadn't protested, because this time it wasn't Crockett who had struck the blow. It was the chair, the system, and the public eye refusing to look away. And Jasmine Crockett, she hadn't said a word through the entire exchange. She didn't shift. She didn't blink. She simply sat in stillness, the embodiment of composure under fire. But her stillness was not surrender. It was signal. It said, "Keep the cameras on. I'm not finished yet." As the live feed continued rolling, unbroken by attempted censorship, Jasmine Crockett knew it was time to shift from history to hypocrisy, from what Josh Hawley had hidden in the past to how he lived in the shadows of the present. She stood without rush, her movement deliberate, every step toward the center of the hearing floor calculated like the final act of a carefully orchestrated takedown. She held no binder this time, no stack of policy memos or legal references. What she carried was thin, just 2 sheets of paper, but the weight they carried was crushing. "I'd like to introduce 2 documents into the record," she began, her voice low but razor-sharp. "Flight invoices, private, charter, round trip." She paused just long enough to let the terms settle. Then she lifted the pages, angling them beneath the document camera so every corner of the country watching from home could see them. "The total?" she said, letting her eyes sweep across the dais. $68,000, marked clearly. Personal, not filed with FEC. Gas didn't erupt. They simmered. Staffers shifted. Phones buzzed quietly. Somewhere, a committee member exhaled through their teeth. The screen behind her now displayed the flight routes. Washington, D.C. to Aspen, Aspen to Jackson Hole. Return flights spaced out over 5 weeks. These weren't campaign events. These were retreats, ski weekends, private club visits, paid for without disclosure, paid for by someone who didn't appear on any campaign report. Crockett let the silence stretch, then dropped the second blow. She stepped closer to the microphone, unfolded a third page, and laid it gently beside the invoices. "The payment," she said, "was processed by an account registered to Abigail Voss." She let the name breathe in the air for a moment. Wife of oil tycoon Thomas Voss, one of the largest private contributors to Senator Hawley's super PAC between 2019 and 2022. There was no need to explain who the Voss family was. Anyone who followed the money in American politics already knew. Thomas Voss wasn't just wealthy, he was an empire unto himself. A man with international oil investments, lobbying ties in Brussels, and a long history of shadow donations through cutouts and shell nonprofits. And now his wife had paid for 2 private jet charters for a senator who campaigned on blue-collar grit and Midwestern humility. A senator who railed against elites from the steps of the Capitol while flying thousands of feet above the very voters he told to tighten their belts. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The fury came through her clarity. "He talks about inflation, about sacrifice, about the people of Missouri making hard choices at the gas pump, the grocery store, the pharmacy," she said. Her words were slow, almost surgical. "He tells them it's their patriotic duty to endure hard times, to be responsible." Then she leaned slightly forward, her expression locked, her voice still calm, but now ice cold. "He flies like a billionaire and tells Missouri families to tighten their belts. So I'll ask you, who's the fraud here?" The line hit like a bullet, not because it was loud, but because it was true. The gallery behind the cameras went still. The press pool erupted into silent motion, fingers flying across keyboards, phones snapping images of the screen, producers whispering into earpieces. Even members of the committee, long trained in hiding reactions, couldn't fully mask the shift in the air. One leaned back and whispered, "She just ended him." Another scribbled furiously, eyes wide. Hawley didn't move. He sat frozen in his chair, his hands folded tightly in front of him, lips pressed together in a line that had lost all its smugness. His eyes flicked from the documents on the screen to Crockett, then back to the floor. He said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Crockett stood her ground a moment longer, then placed the invoices neatly in the official record folder and walked back to her seat without another word. She didn't gloat. She didn't glance around for approval. The moment wasn't about performance. It was about precision. It was about a woman who had walked into that room, not just to challenge power, but to prove that truth, when documented, was more devastating than any insult or slogan. And as she sat, expression unreadable, one thing was clear to everyone watching. This wasn't the climax. It was the calm before something even worse. The curtain hadn't fallen. It had just been torn open, and behind it stood a man with no more places left to hide. The documents had been entered into the record. The live stream still rolled without interruption, and every soul inside the chamber seemed to hold the same breath. Because the next motion wouldn't just end a hearing, it would draw a line between history and accountability. The chair's gavel remained motionless on the table as she straightened in her seat, eyes sweeping over the long, arched room, pausing briefly on each committee member before turning to the camera. Her voice was clear, steady, unflinching. The voice of a system choosing, for once, not to look away. "We now move to procedural vote," she announced. "Motion before the committee to transfer the full set of evidentiary material, digital, written, and testimonial, collected in this hearing to the Department of Justice for consideration of formal criminal investigation under federal statute. The words, though bureaucratic in tone, carried the force of a thunderclap. There was no mistaking what was at stake. The language was federal, the implications irreversible. This wasn't censure. This wasn't political theater. This was referral for prosecution. The voting register, a worn leather ledger, was brought forward, and the roll call began. One by one, names echoed off marble walls. The first yes came quickly, firm and unapologetic. The second followed with more weight, like someone pushing a stone down a slope already steep. Then another, then another. Some said it briskly, others with measured cadence, but none wavered. Even those who had sat expressionless for hours now gave their votes with a clarity sharpened by the moment. When the first no finally came, it was unsurprising. A predictable ally, loyal to Hawley's block. But even then, it sounded more like a whisper trying to hold back a wave. It didn't. The vote continued. All eyes turned to the final few names. And then it landed. 11 in favor. 2 opposed. Motion passes. The numbers weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They were spoken plainly by the clerk, but they landed like a verdict being read in a silent courtroom. The tally hit the room like a shift in gravity. Somewhere, a journalist muttered, "It's done," into a hot mic. A staffer lowered their head, hands covering their mouth, not in shock, but in stunned recognition that this was not procedural anymore. It was judicial. It was the beginning of something far more permanent than scandal. This was legal consequence finally reaching a man who had, for over a decade, moved with impunity. Across the table, Josh Hawley did not reach for his notes. He did not glance at his attorneys. He didn't even blink when the final number was read aloud. He just sat there, jaw clenched, shoulders square, fists pressed tightly into the edge of the table, as if to brace himself against something no one else could see. Then slowly, like a man buckling under something internal and unseen, he did something he had never done in his 12-year rise through political warfare, media spectacle, and party loyalty. He bowed his head, not in prayer, not in reflection, in defeat. It wasn't rehearsed, or it wasn't theatrical. It was a gesture that betrayed everything he had tried to project that day. Control, defiance, calculation. It was involuntary, the body reacting to truth when the mind runs out of excuses. His forehead dipped a few degrees, just enough to signal that something inside him had cracked. Just enough for the entire room to recognize that this wasn't about image anymore. This was about survival. The chair lifted the gavel and struck it once. No drama, just confirmation. Let the record show, the committee has voted in favor of immediate DOJ referral. The impact echoed across wooden walls and through the cameras that continued to broadcast to a nation watching with breath held. This was not a news cycle. This was a chapter, documented, time-stamped, and irreversible. And Jasmine Crockett? She sat still, shoulders steady, hands folded above the now-closed folder in front of her. No applause followed her. No fist pumps or whispered congratulations. Her eyes dropped to the table, not out of modesty, but focus. Because this moment wasn't about her. It was about what had just happened in full view of the American public. For the first time in Josh Hawley's career, truth had spoken louder than power, and power had lowered its head. The vote had been cast, the gavel had fallen, and the cameras were still rolling, but outside the chamber, the storm wasn't over. It was only beginning to roar through the streets, the screens, and the minds of a nation still stunned by what it had just witnessed. The heavy doors of the hearing room creaked open with the solemn weight of history pressing from both sides. Reporters surged forward, but security kept a clear lane as Jasmine Crockett stepped through. Shoulders squared, chin lifted, the folder in her hand now closed for good. The hallway was blinding with camera flashes, a chaotic contrast to the surgical silence of the chamber moments earlier. Her steps echoed against the stone floor, each one a punctuation mark to a day that had redefined the boundaries of truth in politics. Staffers moved aside. Congressional aides stood frozen. Some stared with awe, others with disbelief. but no one turned away. The tension had not dissolved with the vote. It had only spilled into the corridors, into the cell phones of every journalist dialing their editors, into the heartbeat of a country that had just seen power stripped bare by facts. And then, through the crowd, a single voice rose, sharp, direct, slicing through the noise like a spotlight cuts through fog. A reporter holding a mic above the crowd leaned forward and called out the question everyone else had been too afraid or too reverent to ask. Congresswoman Crockett, were you not afraid? Going up against a sitting U.S. senator with his kind of power? It hit like a challenge, not an inquiry. The crowd fell into a hush so sudden it felt scripted. For the first time, Crockett paused. She didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised. She stopped mid-step, the toe of her heel resting lightly against the marble, as if the question had frozen her, not in fear, but in focus. Slowly, she turned toward the voice. Dozens of cameras pivoted with her, the air charged with anticipation. Her eyes found the lens of the nearest broadcast camera, a single focused gaze that pierced through the plastic and glass and into millions of living rooms. She didn't blink. Her voice, when it came, was calm, crisp, measured. Every syllable felt like a blade dipped in fire. I didn't come here to confront power. I came to confront a lie wearing power's mask. The words didn't echo. They landed, like thunder rolling across a quiet battlefield after the final shot has been fired. The hallway exploded, not in noise, but in momentum. Phones lit up instantly. Producers barked orders into earpieces. Social media timelines flooded like a breached dam. That line, those 17 words, became a detonation. In less than 60 seconds, they were quoted, transcribed, captioned. A moment later, they were clipped, shared, and sent across oceans. And within 10 minutes, a single phrase began to climb the digital walls of every major platform. Number Reckoning Day. It wasn't a campaign slogan. It wasn't orchestrated by PR consultants or distributed by a fundraising email. It was organic, a visceral reaction to what millions had seen unfold live. Evidence, accountability, and a woman who never raised her voice to be heard. The hashtag hit trending on X within 8 minutes. Then it hit TikTok, then Instagram, then YouTube. Within 30, it reached #1 globally, overlaid with clips of the hearing, of Crockett's cross-examinations, of Hawley's bowed head. People weren't just watching, they were responding, quoting her, paraphrasing her, printing the line on graphics in white text over dark backgrounds. Young people, veterans, journalists, mothers, workers, men who had never voted, women who had never been believed, all reposting the same sentence again and again, like scripture recited in real time. Back at the Capitol, Crockett didn't smile. She didn't raise her arms in triumph. She simply nodded once toward the reporter and turned away, continuing down the hall as if the building itself were exhaling behind her. The marble corridor swallowed her footsteps as security flanked both sides. Even now she remained unflinching, not cold, but focused, aware that what she had done wasn't just political, it was moral, ethical, human, and heavy. Behind her, the echoes remained, not just in the form of audio or video or typed transcripts, but in something deeper, something tectonic. Capitol Hill, a place often allergic to consequence, had just felt its walls shake from a different kind of pressure. Truth made visible, not screamed, not spun, just revealed. And the moment was irreversible. In the hours that followed, major outlets released statements. CNN opened its evening broadcast with, "Crockett doesn't just speak, she exposes." The New York Times ran a front-page story titled, "The Day Power Blinked." International media from the UK to Brazil translated her quote, airing it over synchronized footage of the hearing. Journalists who had once been skeptical now called it the most disciplined dismantling of political impunity in a generation. Editorial boards rushed to position themselves on what had happened. But for most Americans, no analysis was necessary. They had seen it with their own eyes. Meanwhile, supporters gathered outside the Capitol with homemade signs. Some held up plain white poster board with Crockett's quote printed in Sharpie. Others simply wrote 11-2 and held it above their heads in silence. Veterans stood next to students, parents next to teachers. One man in a flannel jacket held a sign that read, "I've tightened my belt my whole life." She finally unbuckled the truth. Inside, as staffers packed up the hearing room, no one spoke loudly. Hawley's legal team left quietly through a side entrance, flanked by security, avoiding press. His seat at the witness table remained empty, papers scattered, the nameplate still in place, untouched. It didn't matter anymore. That chair no longer held power. The spotlight had moved, permanently, and somewhere, behind the Capitol steps where Jasmine Crockett had just disappeared into a waiting black SUV, a young intern stared down at her phone, eyes wide, hands shaking slightly as she read the top trending headline aloud. She didn't confront power, she confronted a lie wearing power's mask. She whispered the words again, more slowly this time, and smiled, not because it was poetic, but because it was finally real. In America, fractured, weary, uncertain, stood still for just a second longer, held in the gravity of that reckoning. One that came not with noise but with proof, not with fury but with truth, delivered unflinching by the one who dared to stand alone. The doors to room 312 closed behind Jasmine Crockett with the finality of a slamming book. But the story inside those walls hadn't ended. It had detonated. And like all explosions of truth, it didn't stop at the point of impact. It rippled through corridors, through screens, through people. By the time she reached the far end of the Capitol steps, the shock wave was already moving faster than the speed of spin. Inside, staffers were still collecting scattered papers. Josh Hawley's legal team exited through a side door with their heads down, silence clinging to them like sweat. The chair's gavel had long since fallen, but the tremor of that final blow, "Motion passes, 11-2, still vibrated in the very air of Washington. It was the kind of sound that didn't stay confined to stone and oak. It leaked through metal, fiber optic cables, and fingertips tapping out headlines in crowded newsrooms. And by the time the sun dipped behind the Capitol dome, the echo had already reached every corner of the nation. In St. Louis, an auto mechanic who never finished high school rewound a clip on his cracked phone 3 times just to hear her voice say it again. "I didn't come to confront power. I came to confront a lie wearing power's mask." He nodded once and whispered, "Damn right," to no one. In a quiet diner in Amarillo, Texas, the evening shift waitress turned up the volume on the tiny wall-mounted TV. By the time Crockett's words played, forks were laid down. A trucker leaned back, arms crossed, watching like he was witnessing something more than a hearing, something righteous, something overdue. In Atlanta, a community college professor scrapped her entire syllabus for the next day. Instead of reading about political theory, her students would be watching Jasmine Crockett cross-examine power in real time. She told them, "You're not just watching a politician, you're watching a standard being set." People weren't just reacting, they were internalizing. Newsrooms exploded into chaos not because they didn't have the facts, but because they weren't prepared for what it felt like when a hearing actually changed something. The control rooms weren't designed to capture moral clarity. Producers scrambled to replace standard commentary with raw clips. One CNN executive shouted, "Cut the analysts. Just run the footage again." MSNBC rolled unedited coverage through the top of the hour. No graphics, no music, just Crockett's voice laid bare against Hawley's silence. In Chicago, a veteran columnist published a one-line article. For the first time in years, Congress didn't just ask the right questions, it waited for the answers. Over on Fox News, even the most defensive panelists couldn't quite muster outrage. A senior contributor, her hands nervously folded in her lap, simply said, "We're going to need to talk about campaign finance." Because that wasn't optics. That was evidence. By 8 p.m., Runnery Reckoning Day wasn't just trending. It was #1 in the world. But this wasn't another TikTok wave or hashtag campaign driven by influencers. This wasn't aesthetic. This was visceral. People didn't share the clips because they were popular. They shared them like oxygen. Like truth finally had a voice that didn't stutter, didn't apologize, and didn't tremble under pressure. In Baltimore, a middle schooler drew Jasmine Crockett's silhouette in Sharpie on the back of his notebook with the words, "Truth doesn't flinch." His teacher asked if it was for a civics project. He said, "No, it's for my mom. She said, "We've waited our whole lives to hear someone talk like that." In Sacramento, a retired Navy vet who'd voted Republican for 40 years told his daughter, "I don't know what she is. Democrat? Independent? Don't care." She didn't blink. That's leadership. Even in places where her name had barely been known the week before, small towns in Nebraska, desert outposts in Arizona, rural diners in Mississippi, people weren't debating party. They were redefining the word representation. And while the nation erupted in recognition, Jasmine remained silent. No interviews, no tweets, no celebrations. She didn't post a selfie. She didn't retweet the quote because she understood something America was just beginning to learn. Truth doesn't need a victory lap. It only needs to land. And land it had. Not softly, not quietly, but with the full force of every lie that had gone unchallenged for far too long. By midnight, clips from the hearing had been translated into 17 languages. In Spain, Crockett's statement ran as a headline above a photo of Hawley's bowed head. In South Africa, a radio station aired the full 7-minute segment where she presented the tax-free flight invoices. In Australia, her quote trended alongside footage of a wildfire because both, the headline read, "Burned through what no one else dared touch." In Poland, a conservative newspaper broke its usual silence on American politics to print, "When facts are weaponized, justice must carry armor." Today, it wore heels. In France, the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo published a cartoon of Crockett shining a spotlight under a senator's desk with a caption, "No masks left." And somewhere outside D.C., a single mother who had stayed up too late watching the live feed from her kitchen table opened her laptop and typed her first ever political email. It was addressed to her congressman. It read, "More like her. Fewer like him. That's all I want." Because this wasn't just a moment. It was a marker, a before and after, a line etched across the American psyche that said, here's where it changed. Here's where silence stopped being acceptable. Here's where someone stood, armed with nothing but facts, and made a senator lower his eyes. And it hadn't happened in a war room. It hadn't happened in a campaign ad. It hadn't happened on a presidential debate stage. It happened at a table, in a chair, with folders, with evidence, with refusal to be intimidated, refusal to lie, refusal to back down when the room got too quiet or the stakes got too high. Jasmine Crockett had walked into the lion's den not to scream, but to speak. And when she did, the beast didn't roar. It folded. And outside, far beyond Capitol Hill, America heard it happen. Not metaphorically, not secondhand, but live. And maybe for the first time in a generation, the people didn't feel ignored. They didn't feel dismissed. They didn't feel small. They felt seen. And they watched as the woman who showed them what truth looks like under pressure walked back into the shadows without needing applause. Because for her, this wasn't about noise. It was about reckoning. And it had only just begun. The Capitol had gone quiet. Not just physically, though the marble hallways now echoed only with the low murmurs of janitorial carts and the muffled clicks of polished shoes, but spiritually, politically, even emotionally. Room 312 was empty. The lights were off. The cameras powered down. But upstairs, 2 floors above the hearing that had changed everything, Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her office. The silence felt different here. It wasn't the silence of restraint. It was the kind that comes only after battle. Not peace, but the edge of it. The kind of stillness where adrenaline finally retreats and the weight you've carried for hours, days, maybe years, starts to settle in your bones. She hadn't spoken to anyone since stepping out of the chamber. Her staff had offered congratulations. Some whispered, some with tears in their eyes. But she had nodded politely and disappeared into her office before the first headline even hit the ticker. The door was shut now, locked. The overhead light dimmed. The windows opened just enough to let in the low hum of a restless city. Beyond the glass, D.C. shimmered with the artificial life of a capital still pretending it was in control. But inside it was just her and the folder. The same black folder she had carried into that hearing with hands that didn't tremble. It still sat on her desk, unopened since the gavel fell. She didn't need to read it again. She could recall every line, every photo, every timestamp like muscle memory. Each page wasn't just evidence, it was a wound, a breach, a reminder of just how deep political rot could go when no one was willing to dig. Tonight, the folder stayed closed. She reached for a glass of water, but didn't drink. Her fingers curled around the base, not out of thirst, but to keep her grounded. Because now that the crowd had faded, the lights dimmed, and the headlines written, she could feel everything she had buried just to get through the day. People would call her brave. They'd call her sharp. They'd call her fearless. But they hadn't seen the emails. The voicemails left at 2 a.m. by blocked numbers. The packages sent to her office with no return address. They hadn't seen the photo of her mother's house with a red circle drawn around the mailbox. They hadn't heard the way strangers on the street would sometimes mutter her name. Not with admiration, but with menace. They hadn't seen the threats. The ones that came dressed as concern. The ones that came with biblical quotes. The ones that came with her own words thrown back at her, distorted, poisoned, meant to make her regret ever speaking in the first place. She never responded. Not because she wasn't angry, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had long ago decided that fear would not be the editor of her courage. Jasmine never asked for this role. She never wanted to be a headline. She didn't get into politics to go viral. She got in because a young boy she represented pro bono was sentenced to 8 years for a crime he didn't commit. And the prosecutor didn't blink. She got in because she'd watched her hometown be strip-mined by bad policy and worse faith. She got in because she was tired of people in power using the law like a shield for themselves and a weapon for everyone else. But somewhere along the way, that road, once narrow, once humble, turned into something else, something bigger, something more dangerous. And tonight, as she sat alone in the flickering half-light of her office, she could finally admit the truth. She had never chosen this road. Not the one with TV cameras. Not the one with death threats. Not the one that made senators sweat and entire parties whisper behind closed doors. But she had refused to abandon it. Because that road, worn, bloody, unforgiving, was the only one that led forward. She turned slightly in her chair, facing the window. The lights of the Capitol dome glowed in the distance, as pristine and hollow as ever. Below it, policies were drafted, speeches rehearsed. Image consultants earned six-figure salaries, smoothing over the grotesque with patriotic language. But upstairs, alone, exhausted, and still, the truth had chosen to stay up late. A knock came at the door. Light, tentative. She didn't answer at first. Another knock. Then a voice. "Ma'am, it's just me. I brought you dinner. I figured you wouldn't eat otherwise." It was her scheduler. 24 years old, graduate student, first job in government. She always brought Jasmine food when the hearings ran long. Never fancy. Tonight it was just soup in a plastic container and a bottle of ginger ale. Jasmine opened the door slowly and took the bag. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse, unused. The young woman hesitated, then asked, "Are you okay?" Jasmine smiled softly, tiredly. "I'm still standing," she said. The scheduler nodded and turned away, but not before she whispered, "You made us proud today." And just like that, the door shut again. She set the soup down without touching it, the ginger ale unopened. Instead, she picked up a legal pad from her desk, the one with a single line she had written weeks ago, in ink now faded. What if the truth costs everything? Tonight, she flipped the page and wrote beneath it, "Then we pay, and we don't ask for change." The city hummed, sirens in the distance, a plane overhead. But Jasmine sat in the quiet of someone who had earned that silence, not by retreating from fire, but by walking through it. She didn't check the polls. She didn't read the trending tab. She didn't turn on the news, because she knew what they'd say. They'd say she crushed a senator. They'd say she destroyed a career. They'd say she made history, but none of them had seen the real moment, the one with no cameras, no hashtags, the one happening now. A woman sitting alone, in a room still warm from battle, knowing she would do it again, and again, and again. Not because she was fearless, but because she was needed. And because some truths are worth more than comfort, more than career, More than safety, they are worth the cost of standing alone so others no longer have to. As the city exhaled and Jasmine sat in the stillness she'd earned, one truth lingered beyond the evidence, the votes and the viral headlines. A truth not about Josh Hawley or congressional hearings, but about what we allow, what we endure, and what we choose to rise against. As the echoes of Reckoning Day faded from the headlines and Jasmine Crockett sat alone in the silence she'd earned, the real question wasn't what had happened, but what it meant. There's a reason power disguises itself. It knows the truth is too heavy for most to carry. It wears flags, faith, titles. It speaks in polished sound bites and surrounds itself with handlers and headlines. And yet in that courtroom, Jasmine Crockett stripped all that away. Not with noise, not with fury, but with precision, evidence, stillness. In a country where volume so often substitutes for virtue, she reminded America that the loudest person in the room isn't always the bravest. Sometimes it's the one willing to sit with the truth and make others do the same. But the deeper lesson wasn't about Josh Hawley. It was about the silence that came before his fall. The warning signs ignored, the whistleblowers discredited, the well-meaning colleagues who whispered their concerns but did nothing. Jasmine didn't face a scandal. She faced a machine, one that had been running for decades, one that survives not just on greed or arrogance, but on apathy. And still, she didn't flinch. She stood where others wouldn't. She asked the questions no one else dared, and she faced the backlash with the kind of quiet resolve that doesn't make headlines, but breaks chains. The injustice wasn't that Hawley got away with so much. It was that she had to stand alone to stop him. That speaks louder than any gavel. Why did it take one woman with no billion-dollar network, no legacy name, no institutional shield, to do what an entire system failed to do? That's the question we have to carry, not because it flatters her, but because it indicts us. How many others saw what she saw and stayed quiet? How many knew and chose safety over courage? Jasmine Crockett didn't become a hero because she wanted to. She became one because no one else stepped forward, and that's the cost of truth in our time. It often walks alone. But the story doesn't end with her victory. The real test is what comes next, because the most dangerous thing we can do is treat this moment like a spectacle. Clap, share, quote, and move on. Change doesn't come from admiration. It comes from alignment, from choosing again and again to stand beside the people holding the flashlight, not just when it's easy, but when it's dangerous, when it's thankless, when it's quiet. Jasmine didn't wait for the room to applaud. She walked in when the lights were off and lit the fire herself. The human lesson is simple, but fierce. Truth still matters. But it will not walk into the room on its own. It needs people, flawed, exhausted, uninvited, who are willing to carry it. People who will risk being disliked, misunderstood, alone. Jasmine did that, and because of her, we saw what happens when someone refuses to let lies speak unchallenged. So now the burden shifts. The mirror turns. Will we protect truth only when it's trending? Will we stand with justice only when it's convenient? Or will we remember what it felt like to watch someone tear the mask off power and say, this time the lie doesn't win? Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just reveal corruption. She reminded us what courage looks like in real time. And now, it's our turn. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.